My friends, welcome back to yet another reading for our music history moment with the accompaniment of my wonderful dog barking all the way through. We're going to read today about Jeremiah Clarke and Henry Purcell. Jeremiah Clarke, whose dates are usually kept inside parentheses so they won't run away, was a near contemporary of Henry Purcell. He was the organist at St. Paul's Cathedral in London and is best remembered as being the composer of Purcell's Trumpet Voluntary. That is, he actually composed it, but many, thinking it was too good for him, attribute it to Purcell. Some people say Purcell. I say Purcell. This seems unfair. Even in the days before copyright and royalties, this piece is also known as the Prince of Denmark's March. But it is unlikely that the Prince of Denmark composed it. Clarke had a disappointing love affair with one of the ladies in his parish. He was so upset he committed suicide. Unable to decide between drowning and hanging himself, he flipped a coin. It landed on the edge in the mud, so he went home and shot himself. Horrible story. Henry Purcell, however, was probably born in 1659. As with many other composers, especially early ones, Purcell's dates are uncertain. But one of them must have been fairly certain. At least her name was Frances, and she married him. Get that? Date? Purcell is generally considered to have been the greatest English composer since William Byrd, although nobody asked Byrd what he thought of all of this. Fortunately for Henry, Byrd had been dead for several years when Purcell was born, so the two of them didn't have a showdown. Also, Byrd, being dead, was less likely to take offense. It's a pity that we don't know when his birthday is, but the registrar of births can hardly be blamed. After all, how was he to know that this little boy was going to grow up to become one of England's greatest composers? He looked just like all the other little brats crying and slobbering there in his diaper. Nowadays, we keep more accurate records just in case. Henry was the son of Thomas Purcell and had an uncle named Henry, both of whom were also musicians. He also had a musician brother, Daniel. It wasn't the first time in the history of music that there had been several members of the same family who were all musicians. By the time of J.S. Bach, the whole thing had gotten rather out of hand. Purcell began his music career as a boy, singing in the Chapel Royal. The choristers of the Chapel Royal were led by Captain Cook, who is not to be confused with the Captain Cook, who was someone else. Cook, the musical one, had a difficult time of it, since the Restoration was just getting started, and everything was in a mess. There hadn't been much music at all under Cromwell, and everybody was a little out of practice. One writer goes so far as to tell us that there was not one lad capable of singing his part readily. In order to ensure the best quality for the Chapel Royal, Cook sent talent scouts all over the country to steal promising young boys from other choirs. The other choirs were not pleased, but the king thought it was wonderful. After a few years of singing, Purcell was given the apprentice job of keeper, maker, mender, repair, and tuner of the regals, organs, virginals, flutes, and recorders, and all other kind of wind instruments whatsoever. This was an impressive, if rather lengthy, job title. Purcell probably shortened it to something less cumbersome, such as maker of the king's instruments, or just plain Hank the Mender. Later, he was appointed composer for the king's violins, and still later made organist at Westminster Abbey. In 1862, Purcell was made a gentleman of the Chapel Royal, where he sang alto and bass. It was very confusing for those around him. Just when they would get used to his alto voice, he would belt out a low bass note. Musicological research has proven that he probably didn't try to sing both parts at once. In addition to the regular salary, the gentlemen were given an annual bonus. Originally, this consisted of 3 deer, but was later changed to a sum of money, which is more easily divided among 32 men. Purcell was generally well paid for the various duties he performed for the king, which included composing music for coronations, weddings, and birthdays, and the comings and goings of important personages. He was always being pestered to write departing or returning odes. Sometimes he wished they'd just go away and leave him alone. He also composed odes to Saint Cecilia, the patroness of music. He thought it might bring him luck. And he was right. Even though he was often paid out of Secret Service funds, that doesn't necessarily mean he was a spy. One historian has said that in the few last years of his life, music for the theater continued to flow from Purcell's pen. We can appreciate him seated at his desk, his pen overflowing, with pieces of blank manuscript paper scattered around to soak up the mess, hoping that at least some of it will be legible enough to be used in the Dionysian of the Fairy Queen. Sounds good to me. In addition, as long as Queen Mary continued to have birthdays, Purcell was obligated to compose birthday odes for her. Finally, she said she'd had enough and died. To show her how grateful he was, Purcell wrote the funeral music for the Queen Mary. This included several anthems accompanied by flat, mournful trumpets. Whether the trumpets were flat because they were mournful or mournful because they were flat, we are not told. Perhaps they are lamenting the fact that they are not trumpets at all, but trombones, and no one likes to have his name wrong in the program. At any rate, just to show that you can never be too sure that you aren't going to need some piece of music again, Purcell died the very next year. The same music was played at his own funeral, although no one ever thinks of calling it the funeral music for Henry Purcell. He died on November 21st, 1695, the eve of St. Cecilia's Day. Some think Purcell was embarrassed that he hadn't completed an ode for that year, and dying was the only excuse he could think of. Another legend about his death tells us that he came home one night late after having a few drinks with the boys. His wife refused to let him in, whereupon he caught pneumonia and died. It's a great story, but it wasn't Purcell. It was Maurice Greene. Greene was a fine composer, but he had little enough to make him memorable, and it seems unfair to rob him of his one moment of glory. We know it can't have been Purcell because intensive research has shown that November of that year had been particularly mild. That's the trouble with musicology. Some smart aleck is always digging up weather reports and spoiling the fun. That, my friends, is the end of our chapter on Henry Purcell, and also the end of the first section of the book. We are about to move into the Baroque era. Have a lovely afternoon. Have a great weekend.